We are told that ancient cities were built by independent civilizations, separated by oceans, centuries, and language. Each one, we are told, developed its own methods, its own materials, its own architectural logic. That is the accepted framework. Now look at the buildings. In Lima, Peru, there is a section of wall at Sacsayhuamán built from stones weighing between 100 and 360 tons. The stones are cut with angular precision, each face fitted against the next with no mortar, no gap wider than a sheet of paper. The official explanation is that the Inca cut these stones with bronze tools and moved them using rope, wooden sledges, and human labor. That explanation has been repeated in textbooks for over a century, but there is a specific technical problem. Bronze, as a cutting material, is softer than granite. You cannot cut granite cleanly with bronze. You can scratch it, you can chip it. But the surfaces at Sacsayhuamán are not chipped, they are dressed. Smooth, angled with precision that modern stonemasons, using steel tools, describe as difficult to replicate under controlled conditions. The official explanation accounts for the movement of the stones. It does not account for the surface quality. That is where the investigation begins. Now move from Peru to Egypt. The Great Pyramid at Giza contains approximately 2.3 million stone blocks. The average weight is 2.5 tons. Some blocks in the interior and lower courses weigh between 50 and 80 tons. The official timeline places the construction within the reign of Pharaoh Khufu, roughly 20 years. The calculation that follows from that timeline has been examined repeatedly by engineers. To meet that schedule, workers would have needed to place one block every 2 minutes, continuously, around the clock, for the full 20-year period. No ancient Egyptian text describes this process in mechanical detail. There are worker graffiti, administrative notes, ramp theories, but no documentation of the lifting system used on the upper courses, where conventional ramp construction becomes physically self-defeating. A ramp long enough to maintain a workable slope for moving 70-ton blocks would itself require more material than the pyramid. This is not a fringe observation. Engineers have noted it. Architects have modeled it. The official position is that the method remains uncertain. That is accurate. What is less frequently noted is that uncertain is a quiet way of saying the capability existed, the result exists, and the method is unaccounted for. Now here is where the comparison becomes significant. The precision stonework at Sacsayhuamán in South America, built by a civilization that had no documented contact with Egypt, uses the same core technique. Polygonal fitting, no mortar, tight tolerances. The stones are different sizes and shapes, but they lock together using the same mechanical logic as certain pre-dynastic Egyptian structures. Not similar. The same logic. Researchers who have examined both sites note that the fitting method, where each stone is shaped to accommodate the irregular surface of its neighbor, requires either a sophisticated templating system or a way of repeatedly testing and adjusting each stone individually. For blocks in the 100-ton range, that kind of adjustment process requires infrastructure that leaves evidence. There is no such evidence at either site. The question is not whether the walls exist. They do. The question is what kind of knowledge system produces that result, and whether the same system, or something equivalent, could have operated in two locations that have no documented connection. Move further. In Turkey, at the site of Göbekli Tepe, there are T-shaped limestone pillars, the largest weighing approximately 20 tons, decorated with relief carvings of animals in precise anatomical detail. The site has been dated to approximately 11,600 years ago. That date places it before the beginning of agriculture, before the development of writing, before the organizational structures we typically associate with large construction projects. The official archaeological position is that hunter-gatherer populations built this site. That position is supportable, but it introduces a problem that is rarely framed directly. The organizational capacity required to quarry, transport, and precisely erect 20-ton pillars is not a capacity we associate with nomadic or semi-nomadic populations. It requires surplus food, coordinated labor, planning over multiple seasons, and specialized knowledge of stoneworking. If hunter-gatherers built Göbekli Tepe, then either our model of hunter-gatherer society is substantially incomplete, or the people who built it were not what the label implies. The evidence supports the first possibility. The standard narrative quietly avoids the implications of that, and then the site was deliberately buried. Not abandoned. Buried. Someone covered it intentionally, preserving it beneath layers of fill. That act of burial required as much coordinated labor as the original construction. No explanation for the burial has been established. Now consider a pattern across multiple continents. In Japan, off the coast of Yonaguni Island, there is a submerged formation of stepped stone platforms, right angles, and what appear to be carved channels. The formation sits at a depth that places its surface above water during the last glacial maximum. Approximately 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, geologists disagree about whether it is natural or constructed. Some features, the right angles, the parallel cuts, the flat terraced surfaces, are unusual in natural sandstone formations. Others argue the features can be explained by the rock's natural fracture patterns. The disagreement itself is informative. Natural rock formations do not typically generate serious scientific debate about whether they were constructed. The ambiguity exists because the features are precise enough to raise the question. If it is constructed, it dates to a period before every civilization we formally recognize. If it is natural, it is an unusually structured natural formation. Either conclusion is notable. Neither has been settled. Return to the question of global pattern. In Cambodia, the temple complex at Angkor Wat covers approximately 400 acres and contains more stone than all the cathedrals built in medieval Europe combined. The construction is attributed to the Khmer Empire, 12th century CE. The stone is sandstone, quarried approximately 25 miles away, transported by water and land. The carvings across the temple cover nearly half a mile of continuous bas relief. The official explanation for Angkor is more complete than for the Egyptian pyramids or Sacsayhuamán. There are administrative records, there is chronological documentation, there is archaeological evidence of the transport routes. The method, in broad outline, is reasonably understood. But Angkor is useful in this investigation for a different reason. It demonstrates what documented ancient construction looks like, what evidence it leaves behind, how the record appears when the process was recorded. Comparing Angkor's documentation record to the documentation record of the Egyptian pyramids or the Inca stonework makes the silence around the older sites more visible. Angkor was built and documented. The earlier sites were built without documentation, or the documentation did not survive, or it has not been found. Each of those possibilities leads to a different conclusion. The standard assumption is the second, documentation did not survive. But that assumption is applied unevenly. We have Egyptian administrative records for grain rations and worker rosters. We do not have a single document describing the mechanical system used to position 80-ton blocks at height. The administrative record is extensive. The technical record is absent. That specific gap is rarely examined. Consider the stonework of the Tiwanaku culture in Bolivia at the site of Pumapunku. The H-shaped blocks found there are cut from diorite and red sandstone. Diorite ranks among the hardest stones used in ancient construction. The cuts on these blocks include straight lines, right angles, and interior corners. The kind of detail that, in modern construction, requires fixed cutting tools with consistent geometry. A straight interior groove running the full length of a diorite block, with consistent depth and width, cannot be made efficiently by hand percussion or simple abrasion. The tool marks, or the absence of tool marks, have been studied. No definitive tool type has been identified that fully accounts for the surface characteristics. The site is dated to approximately 500 to 600 CE, which places it within a period when the tool inventory available to Andean cultures is reasonably well established. That tool inventory does not include anything that cleanly explains the cuts at Pumapunku. Researchers who work within the mainstream of archaeology acknowledge this as an open question. The standard response is that the methods were more sophisticated than we currently understand. That response is almost certainly correct. The question it defers is, how much more sophisticated? And does that sophistication fit within what we know about the culture's development at that time? There is a broader pattern in this investigation that the individual sites, examined separately, do not fully reveal. The sites discussed, Egypt, Peru, Turkey, Japan, Bolivia, Cambodia, span thousands of years and every major region of the world. They represent cultures with no documented contact during their periods of construction, and yet several features repeat across all of them with a consistency that is difficult to explain through independent development. The preference for working in extremely hard stone when softer materials were available, the use of close-fitting, mortarless joinery in structural applications, the alignment of major structures to astronomical reference points, solstices, equinoxes, cardinal directions, with accuracy that required systematic observation over long periods. The construction of structures at a scale that pushes against or exceeds the documented capabilities of the cultures that built them. By the timeline in which they are said to have built them, independent parallel development can explain shared aesthetic choices. Human perception of beauty follows certain patterns: arches, columns, symmetry. These can emerge separately, but independent parallel development is a weaker explanation for specific technical solutions to specific engineering problems. When two cultures on opposite sides of the planet use the same joinery logic to solve the same structural problem, the explanation that they arrived there independently requires evidence of the developmental path. At most of these sites, that developmental path is not visible. The technique appears. It is used at a high level of sophistication. In several cases, it then disappears. There is no archaeological record of the experimentation, the early failures, the gradual refinement that precedes mastery in every technical domain we understand. Modern engineering has engaged with this question directly in several cases. In the 1990s and 2000s, attempts to construct test sections of mortarless polygonal masonry at Inca-style tolerances, using tools and methods available to pre-Columbian Andean cultures, were partially successful at small scale and with prepared stones. Scaling those methods to blocks in the 50 to 100 ton range has not been demonstrated. The logistics, the number of workers required, the space needed to maneuver blocks during fitting adjustments, the time required per block produce numbers that are difficult to reconcile with the scale of the completed sites. The same problem appears in pyramid engineering studies. There are serious academic papers, not fringe publications, that examine the logistics of the Giza construction timeline and conclude that the conventional explanation, while not impossible, operates at the extreme edge of what the proposed methods could achieve. The pyramid exists. The math, under the standard model, is tight to the point of implausibility. The standard response is that we are underestimating ancient workforce organization. That may be accurate, but it is an assumption added to make the model work, not a conclusion derived from evidence. There's another dimension to this investigation that is less about construction and more about institutional response. Museums and heritage organizations that manage these sites operate under a significant constraint. Their function is preservation and interpretation, not investigation. The interpretive frameworks at most major ancient sites were established decades ago, in some cases over a century ago, and they tend to be revised slowly when new physical evidence raises questions about those frameworks. Unusual tool marks, unexpected material compositions, structural features that do not fit the accepted timeline. The institutional tendency is to classify the anomaly as an outlier rather than revise the framework. This is not a conspiracy. It is an organizational behavior pattern common to large institutions. Frameworks are stable, evidence accumulates within them, and the threshold for revising a framework is high. The result, in the context of ancient construction, is that anomalous physical evidence at major sites tends to be documented in technical literature and not incorporated into the interpretive narrative presented to the public. The placard on the wall at the museum says one thing. The paper in the archaeology journal quietly notes the exception. The exception doesn't disappear. It sits in the literature, unresolved. Consider what the sites taken together suggest about the distribution of knowledge. If the techniques visible at these sites were developed independently, in sequence, by separate cultures, then each culture passed through a developmental phase, reached a peak of technical capability, applied it at scale, and in many cases the capability then ceased to be practiced. The knowledge was not transferred to successor cultures. It was not written down in recoverable form. It was not embedded in a tradition that continued. In the domains of agriculture, language, mathematics, and astronomy, knowledge tends to be cumulative. Later civilizations build on earlier ones. The record of that accumulation exists. In monumental stone construction at the scale and precision of the sites in question, the pattern is different. The capability appears, operates at a sophisticated level, and then is absent from the cultures that follow. One explanation is that the knowledge was localized, specific to a group, not widely distributed, and lost when that group ended. That is plausible. It is also notable that this explanation, applied to multiple sites on multiple continents, requires the same type of localized, non-transferable knowledge to have existed independently in each location. Another explanation is that the knowledge had a common origin that predates the cultures we are examining, and that what we are seeing at each site is an application of inherited knowledge rather than independently developed knowledge. That explanation is more difficult to verify. It requires a source that has not been identified. It also resolves a number of the consistency problems that the independent development model does not. Neither explanation is established. The evidence is compatible with both and with others. What the evidence does not support comfortably is the standard narrative as it stands, which is that each culture developed its methods independently. The methods were adequate to the results, and the silence in the documentation record is simply the result of time and decay. The documentation silence is worth examining on its own terms. Egypt left written records across thousands of years. The Inca used a sophisticated recording system called quipu, knotted cords, that encoded administrative data. Mesopotamian cultures maintained clay tablet archives of extraordinary extent. The Maya developed a written language and recorded astronomical observations with precision. These are not cultures that failed to document their activities, and yet the specific technical knowledge used to produce their most demanding constructions, the knowledge of how to cut, move, and position multi-ton blocks of hard stone at high precision and significant scale, is absent from the surviving record in each case. Administrative knowledge survived, astronomical knowledge survived, religious knowledge survived. The one category of knowledge that produced the most durable physical evidence did not survive in documented form. That specific absence, across cultures that were otherwise thorough record keepers, raises a question that is not adequately addressed by the assumption that the records were lost. The assumption may be correct, but it requires that the most technically sophisticated knowledge these cultures possessed was also the most poorly documented, and that this pattern repeated across independent civilizations on multiple continents. There is a final detail worth noting, and it concerns the buildings themselves rather than their construction. When archaeologists and architects examine the oldest surviving structures at sites like Giza, Sacsayhuamán, or Pumapunku, they consistently note that the oldest sections, the foundational courses, the earliest constructions, are the most precisely executed. Later additions and repairs, attributed to successor cultures working with established traditions, are typically less precise. The quality declines over time at the same site. This is the opposite of what the standard developmental model predicts. In every technical domain we observe directly, early work is less refined and later work reflects accumulated skill. A tradition that begins at a high level of precision and declines is not a tradition that developed locally and organically. It is a tradition that was inherited at a high level and then imperfectly maintained. That pattern, high precision at origin, declining quality over time, is visible at multiple sites. It does not fit the model of independent development. It fits the model of applied inherited knowledge, a technique received, used, and gradually lost. There is one more category of evidence that this investigation has not yet addressed directly: the urban layout of ancient cities themselves. When surveyed from above, through aerial photography, satellite imaging, or archaeological mapping, certain ancient cities reveal geometric organization that is difficult to attribute to gradual organic growth. Mohenjo-Daro, in the Indus Valley, was laid out with a grid system of streets at right angles, drainage infrastructure running beneath the roads, and standardized brick dimensions used consistently across the entire city. The bricks across the Indus Valley civilization, from sites separated by hundreds of miles, conform to a ratio of 1:2004 length to width to height, with a consistency that implies centralized standardization, not independent local practice. That standardization across a geographically dispersed civilization requires either a central authority enforcing the standard, or a shared technical tradition so deeply embedded that it operated without enforcement. Either possibility implies a degree of organizational sophistication that the standard model of the Indus Valley civilization does not fully accommodate. The civilization left no deciphered writing. Its administrative structure remains unknown. Its decline was rapid and, in terms of cause, unresolved. What it left behind are cities that were more systematically planned than many cities built 2,000 years later. The same grid logic appears in the layout of ancient Roman cities, but Rome's urban planning is documented, traceable to surveying traditions, and attributable to specific administrative practices. The Indus Valley grid predates Rome by nearly 2,000 years and has no identified administrative tradition behind it. The result is similar. The explanation is absent. Consider also the question of acoustic engineering in ancient structures. Several sites that present construction anomalies also present acoustic properties that appear deliberate. The king's chamber inside the Great Pyramid produces a resonance frequency of approximately 438 Hz when the room dimensions are measured against standard acoustic physics. That frequency falls within the range associated with the note A close to the modern concert tuning standard. The chamber's granite walls, ceiling, and floor create a reverberation pattern that researchers in acoustic archaeology have noted is not typical of a burial chamber designed for ceremony. It is more consistent with a room designed for sustained tone. The Sacsayhuamán hypogeum in Malta, an underground structure carved from limestone dated to approximately 3600 BCE, has been measured by acoustic researchers at the University of Salford. Certain chambers within it amplify specific frequencies while suppressing others. The effect is precise enough that the researchers concluded it could not be accidental. A space that selectively amplifies sound at specific frequencies carved from rock over 5,000 years ago suggests knowledge of acoustic physics that is not documented anywhere in the record of that period. These are not isolated curiosities. Acoustic properties have been documented at Stonehenge, at Chavin de Hontar in Peru, and at several megalithic sites in Ireland and Scotland. In each case, the acoustic effect is measurable. In none of these cases is there a written record explaining that it was intentional or describing how it was achieved. The structures produce the effect. The knowledge behind the effect is absent from the record. At this point in the investigation, a question emerges that is worth stating directly. If the construction techniques, the urban planning principles, the astronomical alignments, and now the acoustic engineering at these sites all point toward a level of knowledge that exceeds what the standard model assigns to the cultures in question, and if this pattern repeats across cultures that have no documented connection, then the question is not simply whether a particular wall was cut with a particular tool. The question is whether the category of knowledge we are looking at has a source that is not currently part of the accepted historical framework. That is a significant question. It does not require a dramatic answer. It does not require the invention of lost empires or the intervention of forces outside human capability. It requires only the possibility that the timeline of human technical development is less linear than the standard model assumes, that peaks of capability existed which were not built on documented foundations and did not pass their knowledge forward in recoverable form. The evidence for that possibility is sitting in plain sight, at sites that receive millions of visitors every year. The visitors see the structures. The guides explain what is known. What is less often communicated is the size of the gap between what is known and what the structures themselves demonstrate was possible. The buildings still exist. You can visit them. You can run your hand along the fitted stones. You can measure the tolerances. You can photograph the tool marks that have no identified tool. You can stand at the base of structures that took, by current estimates, either an extraordinary concentration of human labor over many decades, or methods we have not yet identified, or some combination of the two. The physical evidence is not in question. The structures are real, they are measurable, and they are not going anywhere. What is absent is the explanation that accounts for all of it. The precision, the scale, the global consistency, the acoustic engineering, the urban planning logic, the declining quality over time, the documentation silence in cultures that documented everything else, and the disappearance of the capability after its peak. The official frameworks account for much of what we see. They do not account for the specific technical details that make these sites unusual. The gap between what exists and what can be explained is not large enough to rewrite history, but it is not small enough to dismiss. Something produced these structures, that something left no clear record of itself. The structures themselves, in their precision, their consistency across continents and centuries, their acoustic properties, their geometric logic, may be the only record that remains. The method is unaccounted for. The result is standing in front of you.